Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. Okay guys, so hey, I have a very interesting topic that we're going to be discussing today and I hope you guys enjoy it. I definitely enjoy doing research on this topic. I was surprised how much information there was out there about this topic. The topic that we're going to be discussing is the guns that were on board the Titanic on its maiden voyage and the ultimate role that they played on board the ship and on the night of the sinking. You see, the guns that were used on the Titanic have gained a lot of attention in recent years due to how much they're on display in popular Titanic films like the James Cameron movie. You see the Titanic's officers using the guns to defend the lifeboats from panicking passengers. You see the officers fire warning shots into the air, and in the James Cameron film, you see some of the officers actually shoot passengers who were trying to scramble into the lifeboats. And probably one of the most popular Titanic myths to come out of the James Cameron film is the supposed suicide of Murdoch, who supposedly shot himself using one of the Titanic's guns. But myths and conspiracies aside, what I wanted to do in today's video is actually look into the true story of the guns that were on board the Titanic. The questions I'm going to try to answer in today's video is, were there actually guns on board Titanic? Were people allowed to bring guns on board the ship? What was the purpose of the guns on board the ship? And ultimately, what role did the guns actually play on the night of the sinking? Were they used at all? So that's the ultimate question that we're going to be looking into in today's video. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so let's start off this video by stating the obvious. Yes, there were in fact guns officially put on board the Titanic by the White Star Line to be used by some of the Titanic's most senior and most trusted personnel in times of extreme emergency. More specifically, guns were issued to Captain Edward John Smith, Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Now, the type of gun that was officially issued to the Titanic was the Webley .455 caliber revolver. This weapon could hold a maximum of 6 shots before needing to be reloaded, and there was a grand total of 4 of these officially put on board the Titanic. 1 gun for every single crewman that I mentioned earlier.
Now, it should also be noted that these 4 men did not walk around the Titanic armed 24/7. In fact, they very rarely had the guns on them. The guns were only to be used in extreme circumstances, like if there was a mutiny on board and the senior officers had to defend their ship from the mutineers. Under normal circumstances, the guns were kept safely locked away in a small arms locker under the protective watch of the Titanic's first officer.
However, despite the fact that there were only 4 guns officially placed on board the Titanic by the White Star Line, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the only guns on board the ship. You see, I did some research into this, and while it was frowned upon by the British government, it in fact wasn't illegal for other people to bring weapons like guns on board steamships like the Titanic at the time period. You see, the British government actually encouraged steamship companies like the White Star Line to make it against the rules for other people to bring guns on board ships, but from what I can tell, they never did this. I found several accounts of passengers actually bringing guns on board the Titanic, and I even found an account of another crewman bringing a gun on board the Titanic, 5th Officer Lowe, and we know that he had one because he ended up using it during the sinking, but more on that later. So, yeah, I really thought this was interesting and surprising. Obviously, security checks back in 1912 were nothing like what we have now, and there were in fact quite a few firearms brought on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage. I was very surprised by this. Okay, so now that we've gone over all of that information, let's now talk about the role that the guns that were officially placed on the Titanic played throughout the maiden voyage and on the eventual night of the sinking.
The firearms that were officially issued to the Titanic by the White Star Line were first delivered to the Titanic before the ship left Belfast bound for Southampton. The guns were brought aboard the Titanic and then given to the Titanic's first officer for safekeeping, First Officer Charles Lightoller.
Now, I'm sure many of you watching this video are like, wait, what? What did Sam say? First Officer Charles Lightoller? Wasn't he the ship's second officer? Well, just so you guys know, that wasn't a blunder on my part. You see, when the Titanic was in Belfast, her senior officer arrangement was actually slightly different than what we all know from history. You see, while the Titanic was in Southampton getting ready for her maiden voyage, the ship's senior officers went through this last-minute crew shuffle, where one person was added to the crew and one person was removed from the crew. And essentially what happened was this caused all of the crewmen, or the senior officers, to have their ranks shifted slightly. So essentially, Henry Wilde, the Titanic's chief officer, he wasn't supposed to be on board the Titanic for its maiden voyage. But Captain Smith, because he had served with Henry Wilde in the past, wanted him on the ship's first time out. So he requested to have Henry Wilde be on the Titanic as his chief officer. Henry Wilde said yes, the White Star Line approved it, so Henry Wilde joined the Titanic. Now, before Henry Wilde was on the ship, the ship's chief officer was going to be William Murdoch, and then Charles Lightoller was supposed to be the ship's first officer. But because Henry Wilde joined it, their ranks got pushed back by one. So it was Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, and then Second Officer Charles Lightoller. You see, originally the second officer was going to be a man named David Blair, but ultimately he got removed from the Titanic due to this last-minute reshuffling of the Titanic senior staff.
Now, it's also important to note that each of the Titanic's senior officers had a particular cabin assigned to them based on which rank they were on the ship. You see, the chief officer had his own cabin, the first officer had his own cabin, the second officer had his own cabin, and so on and so forth. These cabins were located in the officers' quarters, located just behind the Titanic's bridge.
Now, in case you're wondering why I'm discussing the Titanic's senior officers' cabin arrangements in a video where we're supposed to be talking about the guns on the Titanic, well, trust me, there is a reason, and you'll understand this completely in just a minute. Now, it's important to note that the cabins used by the Titanic's senior officers, well, according to the ship's rules, these cabins have to be occupied by the officer of that particular rank. They can't, change cabins and everything later on. So essentially what that means is that after this last-minute crew reshuffling happened, that also meant that all the Titanic senior officers had to change cabins. So originally, while the Titanic was in Belfast, Charles Lightoller was occupying the ship's first officer cabin. However, after this crew reshuffling happened, he was then occupying the Titanic's second officer cabin. So basically everybody just had to change cabins after this reshuffling happened.
Now, because Charles Lightoller received the Titanic's guns while the ship was still in Belfast, he took the guns and placed them in his cabin, the first officer's cabin, like he was supposed to. However, after that, he completely forgot about the guns. Now, when the Titanic arrived in Southampton and this last-minute crew reshuffling happened, well, Lightoller was forced to change cabins from the first officer's cabin to the second officer's cabin. But because he had completely forgotten about the guns, he neglected to tell the Titanic's new first officer, William Murdoch, that the guns were in his cabin. Now, during the first part of the Titanic's maiden voyage, things operated very smoothly on board the vessel, and there was no need for any of the Titanic's senior staff to go and look for the Titanic's guns. Lightoller, by this point, had completely forgotten about the guns, and Murdoch had no idea that the guns were stored in his cabin. However, everything changed on the night of April the 14th, 1912. On this particular day, at 11:40 p.m., RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline and slowly began to sink. Now, the Titanic's senior officers knew that they did not have enough lifeboats for everybody on board. And when Chief Officer Henry Wilde was thinking about the disaster that was about to unfold, he thought that they may need the firearms in order to help maintain order on the Titanic while the evacuation was carried out. So upon realizing this, he then sought out First Officer William Murdoch to ask him where the firearms were stored on board the ship.
Now, when Henry Wilde asked Murdoch where the guns were, Murdoch immediately responded, "I have no idea where they are." How would he, right? Now, upon hearing this from Murdoch, Henry Wilde thought a moment, and he's like, oh, right. The rankings of the senior officers were different when the Titanic was in Belfast. Murdoch probably doesn't know where they are. Then he remembered that Lightoller might. So he went and found Lightoller and asked him if he knew where the guns were, and immediately Lightoller remembered his mistake. So Henry Wilde and Lightoller went to find Murdoch. They did. Murdoch led all of the men into his cabin, and they quickly retrieved the guns. I'm pretty sure Captain Smith was also with all these men when they retrieved the firearms. Now, Lightoller did not think that the guns were going to be necessary for the evacuation of the Titanic. However, Henry Wilde was very insistent. He forced the gun in Lightoller's hands along with some ammunition and said, "You will probably need this later." So Lightoller put the gun in his pocket, and for the time, he forgot about it. Now, I wasn't able to find the exact time that this exchange happened. However, by my best guess, I would say that this happened somewhere between 12:30 and 1 a.m. on board the ship.
Now, contrary to what is most commonly believed, there are actually very few official accounts of guns actually being used on board the Titanic during the evacuation. Now, officially, I was only able to find 4 confirmed instances of a gun being used on the Titanic while the evacuation was underway. And of these 4 instances, only 3 of them resulted in a gun actually being fired. However, it's important to note that in all 3 of these instances, the guns that were fired, well, they were only warning shots. No one in the crowd was actually shot in these instances. Now, there are some unconfirmed reports that state that some passengers were shot by some of the Titanic's officers in the later parts of the sinking, and we'll touch more on that here in a minute. It was also in these unconfirmed reports that the supposed suicide happened, but again, we'll talk more about that later. But the first official account of a gun being fired on board the Titanic happened when lifeboat number 14 was being lowered away from the ship. This lifeboat left the Titanic at roughly 1:26 a.m., and 5th Officer Lowe was in charge of this lifeboat. He said that while he was guarding the lifeboat as it was being lowered over the Titanic's side, he saw a group of men getting ready to rush the boat. So, in order to scare these men away, he fired several warning shots into the air. But, as I stated earlier, no one was shot in this instance, and lifeboat number 14 safely reached the water and evacuated the Titanic. The next incident I found involving a gun happened at lifeboat number 2, which left the Titanic at roughly 1:45 a.m. Shortly before passengers began boarding this lifeboat, Lightoller walked up to the boat to inspect it when he discovered that there were already 25 male passengers and crew waiting in the boat to be lowered away. Lightoller was furious at this, and he pulled out his gun, aimed it at the men in the boat, and told them to get out. Now, the men quickly did this, and the loading and launching of the boat proceeded as normal. It should be noted that even though Lightoller did threaten these men with a gun, there wasn't much he could do because he had yet to load the gun. However, he quickly loaded the gun after this incident at lifeboat number 2 took place. Now, the final 2 instances of guns being used on the Titanic happened when the last 2 lifeboats to be successfully lowered away from the Titanic, collapsible C and D, were in the process of being filled with passengers. In both instances, a group of people attempted to rush the boat, and the officers who were guarding and loading the boat had to fire warning shots into the air to get the crowds to back off. The officers did this, and no injuries were reported in these incidents. However, it is important to note that if a supposed suicide did happen on board the Titanic, and I'm not going to be going into a ton of detail around this topic because I already did cover it in another video. I will include a link to that video in the description below. I believe it happened around one of these 2 lifeboats at this late stage in the sinking. If I had to guess, I would say it happened around collapsible lifeboat D. It should also be noted that this was not the lifeboat that Murdoch was working on. If there was a suicide on board the Titanic that night, I really do not believe it was Murdoch. I think it was someone else.
So, as you all can plainly see, there really are very few official accounts of guns being used on board the Titanic during the sinking. And in all of the instances that they were used, they were simply used as warnings to try to maintain order while the officers filled and lowered away the lifeboats. As far as I know, no evidence has ever turned up to show that some people were shot on the Titanic during the sinking. Now, we've only really talked about the confirmed instances of guns used on board the ship. There are quite a few unconfirmed stories out there of guns being used on board the Titanic. But these stories are pretty hard to verify because a lot of them have conflicting accounts of what happened. Like this person said this person said this, and so on and so forth. The most popular story, an unconfirmed story, I should say, of a gun being used on board the Titanic is the incident that happened around collapsible lifeboat A, the last lifeboat to leave the Titanic, and this lifeboat was floated off. Now, there is enough evidence to say that something did happen around this boat with a gun. Shots were heard during the final stages of the sinking from the area that this boat was at right before this boat floated off the Titanic. However, as I stated earlier, there is so much conflicting information about this boat where one person said they saw this, another person said they saw this, so it's impossible to know exactly what happened. However, there is enough information there to say that something did happen. This is also the boat where a lot of people like to say that Murdoch committed suicide. But again, I don't think Murdoch committed suicide. I dove into that topic in depth. I will include a link to that video in the description below. But yeah, anyway guys, now all of you watching this video now know the story of the guns that were on board the Titanic. You now understand why they were there, their role on board the Titanic, and ultimately what they were used for on the night of the sinking. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave it a like. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot. And I will see you all in the next one. Take care.
Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.